Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. My guest today is one of my favorite teachers and writers and friends. Yossi Klein Halevi is an American-born Israeli author and journalist and a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Yossi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, is a masterpiece, and it won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. His most recent book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was prescient and is really required reading post-October 7th. It was a New York Times bestseller when it came out, and he has since written for op-ed pages in the U.S., including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He is featured in the Times of Israel. He is the former contributing editor to the New Republic, and he has a podcast with Daniil Hartman called For Heaven's Sake, and I Don't Miss an Episode. It is wonderful to be with you, Yossi, from across the oceans.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So there's so much to talk about. I want to start with the news on the day we're talking, even though it will be a little dated when this airs, which is that there was just a music festival in Glastonbury where one of the performers actually started a chant that thousands and thousands joined in on, death, death to the IDF. I'm sure you've seen the video. And I think for those of us who have in some sense adjusted to the ratcheting up of anti-Semitism worldwide, this was just another Rubicon crossed of seeing kind of the relish with which people joined in. And I wondered, since you are often someone who helps me process traumatic moments, how this sat with you.
Yeah, this really was a traumatic moment, and it's hard to have isolated traumatic moments these days. There's such a flow of trauma, you know? And what was so shocking about this event was seeing thousands of young people at a rock festival chanting death. And it doesn't matter what they were chanting death for. You know, even if they would have chanted death for Hamas, I think I would have felt a little squeamish, maybe less so, honestly. But still, you know, to see this a kind of Iranization of Western youth, we're used to seeing masses of radical Islamists in Iran chanting death to America, death to Israel. And so just on that level, when you see masses of people chanting death, it feels like the prelude for actual murder. It feels like you know, you talked about crossing the Rubicon. It felt like there have been gradations of rhetoric, right? It began with "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which sounds almost pastoral. There's a river, there's a sea, it's freedom. And we've transitioned from the pastoral, benign form of genocide to actual calls for murder. And the IDF, of course, is all that stands between the Jewish people and actual genocide. And so, and then the last piece of this really for me was, and this is, people have commented on this, I've seen this on social media, the terrible irony of mass chanting for death for the IDF at a rock festival when you had hundreds of people murdered in a music festival in Israel.
At the Nova Festival on October 7th.
And the Nova Festival. And it was the IDF who came in and actually saved whoever hadn't been slaughtered. And so on so many levels, you know, Jews know, even if we can't articulate it, Jews know that when we see masses of people chanting death, especially aimed at us, we know that this is the beginning of something really dangerous.
And I'm going to say this for the viewers, that I'm going to ask questions that are kind of channeling the skeptics, and not because I believe them. So here's one of them, which is that people I have heard and I can imagine saying, all of you are overreacting to rhetoric. And the same with the globalized, the Intifada. It's you're kind of overstating its purpose. It is actually talking about concern for, empathy for the loss of life in Gaza, the sense that that has happened because of Israel's policies and its army. And that's what we're chanting about. We're not actually calling for death. We're not actually calling for mass terrorism. I want to give you a chance to respond to those voices.
Well, I'm sure that most of the people chanting Free Palestine, for example, don't intend to actually go out and murder Jews. Even people calling for from the river to the sea are not necessarily thinking of actually the actual death of Jews. But it's really hard to separate rhetoric from the consequences of rhetoric after we've seen a series of physical assaults against American Jews in the last couple months, including two that led to deaths. The 81-year-old woman who had been severely burned in Boulder just died yesterday.
Yeah.
And so it's and of course the two young Israelis who were murdered coming out of an American Jewish Committee event in Washington, and who were not visibly identified as Israeli in any way. And even if they had been,
Right.
we are seeing a direct correlation between a mood that's being created and all it takes is a few people to act on the rhetoric. So when you start playing with rhetoric, which we understood that from the river to the sea is genocidal, because there is no way to create from the river to the sea without physically destroying the state of Israel and murdering millions of Jews and expelling the rest. That's how you liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And after October 7th, it should have been self-evident what from the river to the sea means. But we've seen an escalation of it begins with Free Palestine, moves to from the river to the sea, and then it moves to globalize the Intifada, which your apparently next mayor refuses to condemn because he's all for free speech, and that's fine. I'm all for free speech too, but I would ask him whether he would condemn, at the very least, condemn, not censure. All he's been asked to do is condemn. Would he condemn a slogan that Muslims perceived as threatening? I imagine that he would. And so there's something so profoundly disingenuous about this moment. But there's something really beneath all of this, which you hinted at, which is, and I saw it in Michelle Goldberg's just awful column in the Times today about the left is now behaving in a shocking way, just like the right. And what do you expect? Israel has really brought this on itself. And there is this assumption, sometimes unspoken, sometimes quite overt, that we have brought all of this on ourselves. And it began with October 7th. And you heard it immediately. On October 7th itself, you already heard people saying, well, what do you expect? You have an oppressed people. Gaza is an outdoor prison. It's the world's largest prison. And so some people who said this said it with regret. Other people said it with full-throated solidarity. Former President Obama said it with regret. The UN Secretary General probably with half regret. But this was the talk on October 7th and in the immediate aftermath. Yes, of course, it shouldn't have happened. It's a sad event. It's tragic. But there's a context here. And of course, the only time we bring in context in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is when it works for the Palestinian side. Otherwise, context is irrelevant. And so the assumption that that we brought this on ourselves, And then, of course, the self-judgment only intensified because of how we've been conducting this war. There's a deep disconnect between how most Israelis look at the cause of October 7th and how much of world opinion looks at the cause of it. What you'll hear in Israel, including from most of the left, is that October 7th was not about the occupation. October 7th was about radical Islamism and its war against the existence of Israel. If there had been a Palestinian state in place in the West Bank on October 7th, this still, in principle, could have happened. It was not about ending the occupation, and that was not the rhetoric that Hamas used. Hamas said, this is the beginning of the liberation of Jerusalem. This is the beginning of the destruction of Israel. That was said explicitly. In fact, when for Hamas, it is about the occupation, but it's about the occupation that began in 1948, not in 1967.
So on that, the idea, though, that the pressure is all on Israel since October 7th in particular. The faults, the missteps are all Israel's. There is no kind of global pressure focus on Hamas's responsibility and continuation of this impasse that we're at, that has been so bloody and horrific. And that isolation, that increasing loneliness, as you and Daniil talked about it in one of your wonderful podcasts, this sense, I'm just quoting, you said, we find ourselves increasingly back in the nightmare of Jewish history, and that nightmare was ghettoization. And increasingly, Israel feels like there are invisible ghetto walls around us. And I think what you meant was this sense that you're standing alone. Am I right?
That's the feeling. I actually don't think we are alone. I travel a lot on the lecture tour. I'm one of those Israelis who's on the Ben Gurion JFK line, and speaking around America is part of my work. And I've done a fair bit of lecturing since October 7th. And wherever I go, I make a point of saying in the most casual conversations that I'm from Israel, because I like to test the mood. And you know, Jews have a fine sense of who's with us and who's not with us. And when I say that I'm from Israel, I can tell in a flash by, are you averting your eyes? Is there a momentary awkwardness? And over again, the response has been, oh, how wonderful. And we're really concerned about what's happening. Not always, certainly not, but it's enough of the anecdotal evidence has, for me at least, has become a pattern. And I feel that around the United States, less so when I'm in Europe, certainly, but not entirely absent there either. And friends of mine who spend time in the developing world, especially Africa, say that when you say you're from Israel, African Christians respond with such warmth, and of course India. And so this notion that because part of the West, or even much of the West, is turning against us, that the world hates Israel, I think that's a very dangerous place for us to go.
You've done so much work, Yossi, in the area of shared society and insisting on a moral conversation that many in the Jewish community are not having, or not interested in having, or don't know how to begin to have. And your book was a huge part of that, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. Obviously, since October 7th, that book has just a very different lens. But I'd love you to address the moral conversation and maybe the absence of it when we look at the loss of Palestinian life, when we look at the suffering in Gaza, no matter how just this war may be. How should we be having that conversation? How are you having it in your own head?
Now, when I'm traveling abroad and then I come back to Israel, I'm struck by the disparity in the moral conversation in Israel and abroad. When when Gaza is discussed abroad, it almost seems to me that there's no Hamas. It's Israel versus innocent Palestinians. And then I come back to Israel, and there are no innocent Palestinians. It's all Hamas. And it's just going through the looking glass back and forth, and it's profoundly disorienting. And why can't we have a grown-up conversation in which we talk about the threat that Israel's facing, the moral imperative of denying Hamas a victory, denying terrorism the right to seek immunity behind its own civilians and behind world opinion. So there's something that I feel that we're playing out in this war that's not just about Israel and Hamas. It's really about whether terrorism is going to figure out a strategy in which it can't be beaten in the contemporary world because of social media, because of world opinion. All you have to do is goad your enemy into killing enough civilians because you've created the situation, the dynamic in which you're shooting at their civilians from behind your civilians. And you will activate world outrage and begin the process of denying your enemy victory. And so this, I feel, is a moral imperative. And you ask me about what my conversation is like in my head. I have two very conflicting moral imperatives. On the one hand, there's Hamas cannot remain on our border. The regime that did that to the Jewish people cannot remain as a neighbor for the Jewish state. And that, for me, is not just a strategic imperative, it's also a moral imperative of Jewish history. And the other moral imperative about why this war is essential is what I mentioned a moment ago, that this war is also about denying terrorism a strategy of immunity. You can't slaughter civilians, run back across your border, and then hide behind your civilians and cry out to the world, not fair. Human rights, you can't do that. And so what this war has been about is denying Hamas immunity. And it's one of the things this war has been about. It's also been about restoring our deterrence. But so that's on one side of the moral ledger. On the other side is this increasing sense of unease, even desperate fear that we're being dragged into a moral abyss that's going to be haunting the Jewish people for a long time to come. And I don't know anymore what to believe and what not to believe. There have been so many false alarms. We've been hearing about Gaza starvation, from early November 2023, and it was not true. Did it seem to be approaching? Was starvation possible in the last weeks? It seems so. And so I actually, frankly, feel gratitude of all people to Trump for pressuring Netanyahu to end the siege on food supplies. So what would have happened if America would not have pressured us? Would we have allowed starvation to happen in Gaza? And then the reports that, Haaretz just had a devastating report the other day, that soldiers are taking random pot shots at Palestinians lining up for food. Now, that is the definition of a war crime. To say that individual soldiers commit war crimes, there is not a war that I can imagine in which there are not isolated war crimes. The legitimacy of a war is not defined by whether war crimes happen, but whether war crimes are the policy of the military. the IDF does not deliberately target civilians. That is, I'm prepared to swear on that in a court of law. And the reason I can say that is because we know the IDF. We are the IDF. Our kids are the IDF. We were the IDF. There's not a mystery here. We know what the red lines are. We know what we were taught. But that's the ground. But then there are questions. Has the army in this war done everything possible to minimize accidental or collateral civilian deaths? That remains a big open question for me. Could the army have done better? Well, given the fact that we changed the ground rules of this war, that the goal of this war was no longer containing Hamas, which it was in previous wars, but destroying the regime, that also changes the nature of the war itself and of collateral damage. So,
and I just want to push you, Yossi, just on the loss of life, because you're actually painting a picture where the loss of life has been Hamas's strategy, right? This is exactly what they have not just allowed to happen, but almost engineered to happen, to have the world's compassion. But the reality, I guess, let me just finish the question, is that in most Jewish communities I'm seeing, there isn't a sense of urging us to face what that suffering means, even if it was justified from the perspective of what you're saying was a moral purpose. And I guess that's what disturbs some people, is that sense of we're not even going to look at what this is costing. And that's where I want your help.
I think there are a few reasons for why so many Israelis and many diaspora Jews as well don't want to look. The first is the trauma. We are not yet in the phase of PTSD. We're still in the trauma itself. And the hostages keep us in October 7th. They are still in October 7th. And so we haven't begun the PTSD stage yet. And when you're actively in the midst of trauma, you really don't have the generosity of spirit to look at the other, especially when the other is your enemy. That's one piece of it. The other is what you were saying about Hamas's strategy is to maximize civilian casualties on their side. I would go even farther and say Hamas's strategy is not so much to kill Israeli civilians. That's a bonus. That it instills terror among Israelis. But the really important strategy is to create the situation that there will be large numbers of Palestinian deaths.
Yeah.
And so when you know that that's the strategy, it's really hard to have empathy for a people that has this kind of leadership. And finally, and this is, I think, a very big piece of it, we are under assault from a lynch mob. There's a global lynch mob that is accused Israel of the absolute worst crimes possible, and we know we're not committing those crimes. And so in that environment, it's really hard to have that generosity. And I'm speaking very personally now, Abby.
I know, I think you're channeling all of that's part of what our compassion is being tested. And I know that you're, in a sense, my rabbi on helping me kind of come back to the things that used to, I think, not just define me as a human being, but as a Jew. And the fact that none of this shared humanity seems reciprocal right now is very difficult.
And still, the first months after October 7th, I couldn't look. I didn't want to see the suffering on their side. I couldn't. I actually physically couldn't. In the last months, I'm forcing myself to. It's almost as if I'm emerging from a deep freeze.
Now, Yossi, again, just before we move on, because I want to get to Iran, in your book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, you said, I believe that we are meant to be a blessing to each other. And you were talking about the Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. Do you still feel that way? And do you see a path to that kind of not just expansiveness, but partnership?
I think that this war has opened up the possibility of expanding the Abraham Accords. So if we take that idea of mutual blessing and expand it away from the Palestinians to the Arab and Muslim world generally, there is a possibility of emerging from this war with additional partners in the Arab and Muslim worlds. Now, that can't happen without some easing of the Palestinian tragedy. And my hope is that within a regional context, within a regional peace agreement led by the Saudis, we can have some way of, if not fully resolving this conflict with the Palestinians. I don't know if it will ever be fully resolved, but at least substantially easing the suffering and the tragedy. And so blessing might be a little bit of a stretch at this point with the Palestinians. I can see mutual blessing already happening with the Abraham Accords. Just before October 7th, I was in Morocco, and it was an extraordinary experience. You know, I walked everywhere with the kippah, and I felt safer in Casablanca and Rabat wearing a kippah than I do certainly in London or Paris, or for that matter, maybe even New York these days.
So when sorry, go ahead.
And so much of the Arab world is sick of this war and is sick of seeing its future mortgaged to this conflict. And I don't believe, and here I think the Israeli right is living in illusion, that we'll be able to reach peace with the Arab world without significant gestures to the Palestinians. It's not possible. But what that means exactly and how that will square with our deep security fears, which have only been exacerbated, of course, since October 7th, I can't begin to get my head around that.
And if you were invited in to the Prime Minister's office, which I don't think is going to happen tomorrow, but and he asked you, tell me what you think should happen with Gaza. What
This
would be
Prime Minister?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hypothetical next prime minister, but it's more your vision, your utopian vision of what actually you think is realistic and should happen. Should be the next chapter for Gaza.
Well, first of all, we need to signal to the Arab world that we're changing course, and the goal is not annexation. This is the first government since 1967 that has stated its official policy. The platform of this government is annexation. We've never had that before.
Annexation of the West Bank or Gaza as well? Of the West Bank.
They're not explicitly saying Gaza, but we certainly have elements in this government that intend to resettle, empty out Gaza of Palestinians, expel, in other words, and resettle the Gush Katif, the settlement block. Now, let's take it a step back. The first step is an unequivocal message to the Palestinians and the Arab world. We have no intention of expelling anyone, and we have no intention of resettling Gaza. The 2005 disengagement is irrevocable. That's first of all. Secondly, in terms of the West Bank, the goal is not annexation. And I would like to see a settlement freeze on areas that are deep within the heart of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and settlement building continuing along the border in what we call settlement blocks, areas that will almost certainly remain under Israeli control. But the truth is that everything is so in flux that beyond a partial settlement freeze, which would send a very important signal to the Arab world, there's really not much that Israel can do at this point. But I think that's a very significant step.
But in terms of leadership, of who's making these decisions as to who's running it.
What I would like to see is an Israeli prime minister speaking directly to the Palestinian people. Yeah. And I don't know if we have had that since Yitzhak Rabin, frankly.
And you mean like in talks, not publicly speaking messaging. You're talking about behind the scenes.
Publicly. Absolutely publicly.
And saying what?
And to talk about the tragedy of this conflict. And to begin with the question of why does the Palestinian national movement always bring disaster on their people? What's the pattern here? Going back to 1947. And the pattern is you always underestimate Israeli and Jewish resolve. You always think we're on the verge of this time you really have us on the wrong. And it never works out that way. Why not? And there's a very simple reason for that. Because we're not who you think we are. We are actually not Rhodesia and the Belgians in the Congo or the French in Algeria. One more push, one more act of terrorism, and we're going to run for our lives. First of all, we have nowhere to go. And second of all, this is where we wanted to go. This is where we belong. And until you, the Palestinian people, begin to understand that we're not a foreign implant, we're not colonialists, no matter what they say on American campuses, what your experience with us should have taught you by now is that when you hit us hard and then you hit us harder, we respond by digging in more deeply. Exactly the way you do, my pal. Exactly the way you do, for a very simple reason. You're an indigenous people and we're an indigenous people. And when you hit an indigenous people hard, the response is to dig in our heels, because that's how indigenous peoples respond. And so October 7th didn't intimidate us. It enraged us. It turned us into people that we might not have recognized in ourselves on October 6th. In exactly the same way that you would have responded to an October 7th. And so I would begin speaking to Palestinians in exactly that way.
Okay.
Until you don't start giving up your fantasy version of Jewish history. There was no ancient Jewish presence in this land. It's a Zionist invention. I've heard that over and over from Palestinians. There was no temple on the Temple Mount. It's a Zionist invention. The Holocaust is a Zionist invention intended to blackmail the West with guilt. And so until you start coming to terms with who we are, we're not going to grant you what are your rights. And I want to grant you your rights. And again, I'm speaking now as the
But Yossi, beyond that, you've also said that we need to understand their narrative. That's very much throughout your book. So it's not just your misunderstanding or you're minimizing or you're actually erasing ours. We can't erase yours.
That's the second stage. Now, when I wrote my book, in the stages that I went through in my process really go back to the late 1990s. And in 1998, I went on a journey into Palestinian society, a religious journey as a religious Jew, into Islam and Palestinian Christianity. And it was a 2-year journey. And I went into mosques and monasteries, and it was an personally extraordinary journey. And the first step then for me was to listen to the Palestinian now. And so before I wrote my book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, explaining my narrative, I went and listened to their stories. And I wanted to understand, and I tried to read as deeply as I could in Palestinian literature, Palestinian narratives, and absorb that. And then I wrote what for me was a sequel. Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor was a sequel to the book that I published about the journey that I took in the late 90s. And now my approach is the opposite. Now, after October 7th, I begin with my story. And for a very simple reason, our story is under systematic assault. The Palestinian narrative is being recognized and celebrated everywhere. My narrative can scarcely raise its head. And so I'm not going to begin by honoring your narrative anymore. I'm beginning by speaking about my narrative and telling you that if you can't come to terms with my narrative, I'm not going to come to terms with yours.
Okay.
It's not going to be a one-way outreach anymore. I don't have the energy for that.
Okay. Let's talk about Iran. Your piece in the Times of Israel, which was very strong on June 22nd, the headline was, this had to be done, in terms of first what Israel did and then obviously Trump's response for America. You say there are moments when leaders need to decisively deal with an existential threat and not allow fear of the consequences to paralyze them. You also said it was probably one of the most seismic, I think, kind of global strategic moments for Israel in its history. Can you just give us a sense now? I think we're 2 weeks out. It's hard to keep track of just how are you processing that turn of events, which for many was really unexpected.
I've been frankly advocating an Israeli strike against Iranian nuclear facilities for 20 years. And I worked for many years with Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to Washington, on this point. And Michael and I never advocated an American attack on Iran. That was something that we felt as Israelis we didn't have the right to ask for. But certainly we were calling for American understanding of a future Israeli strike against Iran, which for me was and remains an existential issue. And it's very straightforward, and this is really the doctrine that has governed Israel since Menachem Begin's attack on Saddam Hussein's reactor in 1981, which is a country that is committed to the destruction of the Jewish state, cannot be allowed to have the means to implement that vision. And so that's been the doctrine in Israel since then. And what my assessment of the strike and its effectiveness is, you don't know who to believe. But I tend to still believe the IDF and the Mossad. And when they say that we have significantly set back the project without entirely uprooting it, that's, I think, a reliable benchmark for what's happened here. I'm a little wary of gloating, and there is some gloating that that I've heard, especially among some American supporters of the strike on Iran, who were saying that they were in effect taunting the skeptics and the opponents, that you skeptics were warning of World War III, and all we got back was a symbolic missile attack on an empty base, basically a replay of Iran's response to Trump's assassination.
Soleimani.
And so, yes, that's how it's played out for now. But this is not over by any means. And we may well have to do this again. And Iran may have capabilities that they haven't used this time. And Iran's capacity for profound damage is something I don't underestimate. So I think we all need a little bit of humility here. Certainly this round has succeeded, I think, as well as it possibly can. Certainly from Israel's perspective, we achieved two significant, even as you put it, historic milestones here. First of all, we had uninterrupted mastery over Iran's skies for 12 days. About 10 or maybe even 15 years ago by now, I spoke to a very senior person in the Israeli military establishment. And I said, how much damage realistically can we do to Iran's nuclear program? Again, this goes back to 2010, 2012. And he said, the problem for us is that we get only one shot at Iran's nuclear program. The pilots go in, they drop their payload, and then they have to get out as quickly as possible because they're going to come after us with everything they've got. We were able to drop our payload and do it again and again for 12 days. We were able to have a leisurely attack here. And this official said to me then that the only reason the Americans can take out Iran's nuclear facilities is because they will have mastery over Iran in Iranian skies for as long as they want. Well, we had it. So that's an extraordinary achievement.
And part of that was the preparatory embedding people on the ground, making sure there were anti-drone missiles set up, or you have the language. They were already there.
It's just what can I say? It's mission impossible, really. And the other historic achievement was enticing America to join the war. And we enticed America to join because we were winning. That's why America joined, not because we were desperate. Trump did not save Israel. Trump saved American honor. If a nuclear Iran is a global threat, and certainly to regard the world's leading exporter of terrorism as a country that should not have nuclear weapons should be a consensus issue in the West. It's not only an Israeli issue. So when Trump joined the war, he was in effect reinforcing the Israeli argument that this is not our war. He wasn't coming in to help. He was, I saw the way this was phrased in much of the American media. Trump joined Israel's war.
Right.
No, Trump.
The Times actually had that first headline and changed it.
Yes. And I've seen other publications that had that headline and did not change it. This was not only Israel's war. This was the region's war. And I think this was the West's war. And the German Chancellor, Merz, actually said it. He said, Israel is doing the dirty work for us.
And not just the West, wouldn't you say, also for the Arab countries as well?
Primarily for Arab countries.
So let's just end with the Israeli psyche right now. What you talked about this on the podcast, and it really struck me watching it from the U.S. was just, again, another miracle, which is all these Israelis rushing home when bombs were being dropped on Israel and several getting through. There were planes, crowded planes, and people saying, how do I get back? And that's not necessarily, I think, something that is shared by every population in every country. I'll speak for myself. I don't think it would be my first impulse is just to get home. And it was your impulse. It was so many Israelis. And this is after the October 7th trauma, after the displacement of people in the South, in the North, after sending our young people, I should say Israeli young people, daughters and sons, not just in once, but multiple times to serve, reservists having to leave their families and their jobs, taking huge financial hits to keep serving, a war that's not ending, and hostages still with, chained in dungeons. Just the fatigue would be understandable. And yet there seemed to be almost a resurgence of solidarity, unity, patriotism, togetherness, patience with each other, setting up sleeping bags. I don't want to overstate the hardship, because there's obviously gradations of hardship everywhere. But can you just reflect, after that long question, how do you diagnose this?
My wife and I were abroad and got back home just before the war. And when we're sitting in the shelter that first early morning, and the siren is sounding, and we both had the same feeling, which was, thank God we managed to get back. It's a very strange reaction, to being in a shelter. And it was so instinctive. And, Israelis have this relationship to the country almost as parents to a child, especially when the country is vulnerable, when the country is going through trauma. It's really hard not to be there. And just on the most basic level, it's you have kids there. You want to be with your kids. You want to know how your friends are doing. And you just want to feel it. You don't want to be reading about it. And that, I think, is a decisive element in Israeliness. You need to draw closer when your country's in trouble. And that also goes, for when your country's having a moral crisis, when it's having a moral nervous breakdown, when democracy is under assault, as it's been here. Your instinct isn't revulsion. It's a kind of fierce love. It's a mother's love. And I think so many of us feel that. But when listening to your characterization of the Israeli mood, yes, all of those qualities were in place in the 12 days of the war. People in the shelters were helping each other, and there was a great deal of solidarity among neighbors. That's all true. But at the same time, I would not characterize the mood in Israel as being expression of solidarity. We have a government whose DNA is to turn one group of Israelis against the other. That's how it feeds. It feeds off of schism, and schism is the source of its power by activating its base. There's a siren right now. I'm serious.
Wow. Do you need to go? Okay.
I don't know what it is, but
thank you, Yossi. Thank you.
Continue. Wonderful to talk.
Thank you. Please go be safe.
Sarah?
I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight. I thank Yossi Klein Halevi for being with me. I hope and trust he is safe, and we will update you. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.